gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
So I watched the entire appearance of Sam Seder on PBD Podcast. Patrick Bet David has a podcast. I think it's just called the Patrick Bet David Show. It's on, his whole thing is called Valuetainment. And Patrick Bet David's deal is that he used to be a pretty shady businessman, ran some kind of multi-level marketing kind of like salesmanship type of gig. That's where he made millions of dollars. And then now he's putting a lot of that money into a media business. And so all of his commentary is very capital oriented. He very much speaks from a capitalist perspective. He speaks on other topics as well, but, to the extent that there's any value to anything that he has to say, I would say it's in the business realm just because he does come from that. So even though he's a shady businessman, this is a guy who actually has some understanding of like how a business and taxes and that sort of things work, just on a technical level. So even if his commentary to that effect is, essentially the greed of a capitalist or somebody who believes in the ability to make profit unchecked by the government off of something like a multi-level marketing scheme. That's where this guy's coming from. My point is that when he's talking about cultural topics and stuff like that, I think he says some of the dumbest commentary I've heard from any conservative, because from people like Ben Shapiro or others like that, they at least have like really well sharpened arguments, even if the arguments are dumb. But this guy just like literally says very dumb things, like just the way he puts his arguments are stupid, and so I think that there's a reason he has some good reach, but I think there's a reason that his impact is somewhat stunted. I imagine that business types that are looking for affirmation to their pro-capital beliefs probably get a lot more out of this guy. But I don't think that he has the same kind of like cultural impact that somebody like Ben Shapiro has, or Jordan Peterson or something like that. I do want to point out that all these guys are rich. All these guys who do media like this are rich, including Sam. It does seem like doing it in the way that they do it requires a certain amount of just existing capital, whether you spend that on advertising or you spend on having a certain amount of sustainability for a while so that you can get on your feet. I don't really know, but there's definitely a pattern there. I don't think Sam is nearly as wealthy as Patrick Bet David, but they're both wealthy guys. I guess it's a business that requires wealth. It takes investment, and that's why either people start it because they have a bunch of money themselves, or they get investment from somewhere. That seems to be the pattern that I'm seeing. But anyway, I think this is a really interesting debate. Sam is doing really good in these debates lately. And that's the main reason it's interesting. It's not really interesting because they have a lot to say. In a lot of ways, even if the things they say are kind of outside of the like usual echo chamber of left-wing politics or whatever, it's like you kind of already know a lot of what they're going to say. And there are some moments where they get into the weeds and the details of everything. And so, I would maybe suggest that people watch it if they're interested in that specifically. But it is tough to get through because it's a lot of it's basically four of these conservative dudes on as various levels of psychopathy, various positions of the scatter plot graph of conservative psychopathy. And they're all just arguing with him at once. And for the most part, it stays at least to Patrick Bet David and his co-host talking against Sam and them going back and forth. But there are multiple moments where they're just all talking at once. And I don't really know why they would set the show up this way, because it's so obviously outsized against Sam that it looks bad from the outset. And then also the fact that he holds up so well just makes him look even better. Like, if he was just up against one guy, then, which he was last time he talked to Patrick, or no, he was up against his co-host as well. But, if he's just up against one guy, then at least the argument can always be made that one side did better than the other. One side looked better because of this, whatever. But it's like, if you got four dudes arguing against one guy at once, and he's holding his own relatively easily, then it's just hard not to look at that person as like, at least the best performance in the room. And so Sam has been good at that lately, and that seems to be increasingly what his brand is not just like the debater guy, but the guy who's confident enough to take on multiple people literally at once. And, I put out a video not too long ago about like whether debating is worth doing at all, like what the point of debating is. And I think I was talking mostly in terms of the spectacle sport of debating, right? Like, debating with people I don't think is inherently bad. I think there's a lot of good that comes out of an exchange of ideas. But I think when it comes to this entertainment aspect, it's difficult to do it right. But to the extent that somebody is doing it right, I would say that it's Sam. And it's because he has a lot of experience doing it. And he has a lot of perspective, too, about how to do a debate responsibly. Like, Sam has said multiple times that he thinks, while it might be appropriate to go to a conservative's platform or like somewhere like Fox News and talk to somebody, that conversation should be adversarial. And he's emphasized that he does not care about maintaining a relationship with whoever it is that he's talking to, because he's more interested in arguing against their ideas and in some moments making clear that the substance of their ideas is morally abhorrent. And you can do that in the context of a debate. But I think it breaks the rules, right? It means so that you have to talk to somebody in a way that is not inherently respectful and obliging. And I think that because of that, it has definitely affected Sam's reputation, not just with people like Tim Pool, but I think he was, banned from Fox News as well. And I think none of it is a knock on his character. I think it's a positive thing, because it shows that he is more interested in standing up for what he believes in than like kowtowing to some sort of media game and like agreed upon media trained behavior. And I also think that it's made him much more effective in these debates, because he knows how to not back down and he knows how to not play nice, instead of making a clear distinction between himself and his opponent. And he is decent at pulling his punches too and not being openly disrespectful. I do think that he makes a conscious effort to not be openly disrespectful, because that might be his instinct to an extent. And I think probably as he's gotten older, he has less interest in just being openly disrespectful to whoever his interlocutor might be, maybe unless it's like a caller into his show or something like that. I guess it just depends on who it is. So these conversations with Patrick Bet-David get relatively heated, but they're mostly respectful. And the interesting thing is, especially in this one, is you really see these guys, what they want to do is they want to characterize Sam, and they want to take his ideas and repackage it into something that they can say like a name they can call him, or say like, this is what you are. And Sam points out in this debate that like a lot of times it's not very much attached to any type of real policy or like the effects or outcomes of policy. And so that really kind of characterizes this entire debate. And that's mostly what I'm going to show, just some small moments, a little bit of the policy discussion. If you're interested in more of like the policy they get into, there's not that much of it. But, a little bit later on in the full video, they get to some stuff like that. But for the most part, the dynamic is that Sam's trying to talk about policy, and they are kind of turning it back to a more personal, like prescription style rhetoric of saying, this is what you believe and this is what it says about you. And in some cases, I guess that would be appropriate. I could see myself doing that against some kind of like right-wing fascist or something like that, describing what their beliefs are. But the way they do it is just kind of so stupid and just like totally sidesteps the point of any policies that they're going to bring up. So I'll play this first clip, and this is just an example of how this is, you know, all of these guys at once, and how, you know, how heated they are with Sam Seder, and just how good he is at keeping his cool in the midst of that.
Why was the border open for 4 years? Answer me that question.
First of all, the border was not open.
Give me a. Are you kidding me? Look at the. What do you mean the border
Sam,
wasn't open? Are you?
Sam,
Hold on. Did you smoke
you know
before
what I
you
love
came in
about
here?
this?
That's ridiculous.
By the way, Vinny, here's the part
You're
though.
full of it, bro.
Open border would mean that we have no records of people coming across the border. The law in this country has been that if you put your foot in this country, it's an international law, it's a U.S. law. If you put your foot in this country and you apply for asylum, you are due a process to do that. 98% of those people who are then what you guys would call catch and release come back for their hearings. We are woefully understaffed in terms of like immigration judges, and that process is definitely broken. I would love to see more money spent in the processing of these people so that we can establish which ones, like your family,
Like my family as well, illegal immigrants.
No, but came in through a refugee status. They weren't citizens on day one. They came in, they went through a process, and it's possible at that time, I mean, I remember, you know, I was old enough to remember the Iran hostage situation. I remember the fallout afterwards. There may have been some form of temporary protected status, whatever it was at the time, that allows people to come in. Then they're assessed and processed. It's determined that, yes, their claim for asylum is appropriate or not, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we're looking at there.
So this guy, Vinny, who's yelling at Sam here, he probably shouldn't have been there. The debate was like much better off with it. He didn't really add very much to it other than this just like incredibly intense yelling and, you know, whatever. He's supposed to represent like a patriot or whatever, but he just comes off as like incredibly unhinged. It's definitely a moment that you can see Sam Seder clearly looking better because he keeps his cool. And I think the whole thing with the border and what they're actually talking about with the border, they get into some information about that. But for the most part, they're kind of just throwing things at Sam, telling him to explain them, and then kind of throwing their hands up and scoffing in disbelief. And it's because they don't really want explanations on these things. They don't really want to get into actual information, root causes, and like detailed context about why certain things might be happening. They're really just going for talking point after talking point after talking point. And that's what you see this guy Vinny doing here with open border. And Sam points out, like in pretty literal terms, that the border was not open. And this is something that right-wingers say all the time. Like people who watch Fox News, they say this all the time, all day on Fox News about Biden, open border, open border, open border. And it's something that people have become very comfortable saying. That was never true. And so if you look at the numbers and you want to talk about like how many people were coming in here versus how many people were coming in there, there's a spike in the graph that they point to because of COVID. You know, whatever. If you say that Biden was welcoming to immigrants in a way that Trump was not, then, or that it happened after COVID, so that's why the big spike was there. All of that's fine, but the point is that those are not people who those are legal border crossings that they're pointing to. And so really what they're complaining about is immigration at all. And saying that the border is open is not that there. Sam points out that there would be no documentation of these people if the border was just open. And so it's really a question of like, are people allowed to immigrate to this fucking country or not? Because even under Biden's policy, it's not easy to fucking do. A lot of those people are being deported now or being seeked to be deported now because they weren't able to get their papers right in the fucking meantime. You think that's because they weren't trying to? Of course they were trying to. They came here for a reason. And so I do think that at a certain point, there's just a moralistic argument that has to be made here to cut through the, all this quibbling about numbers and how terrible, because they're trying to make a moralistic argument, and they try to make it about an economic thing about like, oh, they're coming and they're taking jobs for less labor and exploitation. But these guys are not in favor of protections from exploitation. They're in favor of keeping people from south of the border out of the country. It's that simple. They have convinced themselves, either for racial reasons or for supposedly economic reasons, that it's better if we just don't let people in from south of the border, even though economic data shows pretty clearly that that's not the case, that it's good for everyone. They pay into taxes, and even if they were not being actively exploited by employers who are looking for cheap labor, which, by the way, would not be happening if they were documented. And because of those people that were coming through under Biden, that spike in people legally crossing the border, those are not people who are being exploited for cheap labor. Those are not people who are harming the economy by taking jobs for less than a citizen can take a job for. So all of these kind of talking points get mixed up because they are trying to they're trying to use the data to justify what really is a fundamental belief on their part, which is we got enough Mexicans, we got enough people from south of the border, we don't want any more. It's that simple. That's what it comes down to, certainly from a brave patriot like this Vinny guy. And really, the fundamental thing that I think is going on in this debate, which I do think is worth pondering, it's worth digging into, and there is definitely an interesting example of it in this debate, is just a kind of a difference in the way that left-leaning people and right-leaning people think about these subjects. And I do think that I'm not a psychologist, but there's some psychological backing to the idea that on the aggregate, the way people who are left-leaning think is different or distinct from the way that right-leaning people think. And you can't make that as a blanket statement because most people are kind of like weird mixtures of the two. But there are patterns. There's reasons some people correlate to the right, and there's reasons some people correlate to the left. And a lot of it has to do with how do you process information about the world? How do you process information about policies? And anything having to do with politics, something that affects you, something that doesn't affect you. And there's a key difference, and I'm going to make this argument without making it about calling conservatives stupid, because while that is very fun for me, and it wouldn't be the first time I've done it on this platform, that's not the point I'm making here. And I do think that this is important to absorb in order to understand conversations you might have with people around you better, not so much these type of debates, but in real life, you can take this information I'm about to tell you and apply it and look to the people around you, and you'll see what I'm saying. And you'll start to recognize better ways to communicate with people because of it. So the way left-leaning people tend to think is a more creative style of thinking. It's a little bit more, it's like lateral thinking, where there are images that come up in your mind, and so you describe the images and you describe scenarios, and that leads to other images of other scenarios, and so you describe those. And it can be easy to get lost as you are describing these different things. This happens to me all the time on this podcast because that's what I'm doing. I'm describing things and I'm trying to create a detailed image, and it's useful. That kind of thing is useful for creative thinking, ideas, describing things in detail to people, describing things in an exciting way to people. That way of thinking is useful for that. The right-leaning way of thinking is a little bit more straightforward, and it's like associated with conscientiousness as a trait. And so the best example would be, rather than talking about the mechanics of what legal and illegal immigration looks like, what the context of those people's life might look like before and after they get to the border that informs like what the process should or shouldn't be, conservatives are more interested in a straightforward description and way of thinking, something that they can land on and say that's what it is, because it allows them to move on. And the example here is open borders, right? It's an open border. And so they can literally yell till they're blue in the face, describing and justifying why, that it's an open border, but ultimately it doesn't come down to a lot of information, because it starts with the very simple and straightforward idea, something they can really hold on to, that is open borders. And that is useful in terms of getting things done and being productive. Traits like conscientiousness are usually associated with people who do more physical work and that sort of thing. Where, like I said, the open-minded trait is usually associated with people who do more creative work. And so what this means is that usually in these debates, there is a butting up against of the way people think and describe things. And I don't think it's a lost cause necessarily, but I think that it is important, and I think what Sam has gotten pretty good at is describing things, being able to say things simply and quickly, but also not underplaying the complexity of the issue. And that's really important and difficult to do, because when you appeal to the complexity of an issue, that's when it can be easy to get lost in the images and the different scenarios that you need to describe what you're trying to describe. So being able to take something complicated and boil it down to a simple point that you can make that can stick in the mind of somebody who's looking for a simple point to grasp onto. Again, not necessarily because they're stupid, because they recognize the utility of being able to make something simple and then move on. That's as generous as I can be to the pattern of conservative thinking as I see it. But let me play these couple more clips here just to show you kind of what the dynamic of the rest of this conversation was, and then I'll wrap this up.
Sam, respectfully, I just figured out who you are. I'm telling you, I just figured out who you are. Deep down inside of you, you are driven by so much power, control, a deep-rooted feeling matching the qualities of a communist that wants to tell you what to do, and you think you know what's best for others, and if it isn't your way, everybody else is wrong. And by the way, an extremely unattractive quality,
literally
but
just
very,
advocating for higher taxes on super wealthy people.
No, you're not, because what you just said,
$2.5 million.
What you just said, Stacey, let me just make the point here. You just said people who left California and New York, your first response was they're evading as if they have to pay you. That's not how this works. They're evading taxes. These guys are tax evaders. They left. No, it's called, if a company offers better benefits. Are you on Rumble?
Only take the regular basic Uber?
Do I only take the regular
Basic Uber.
Lyft?
Lyft? Do you never use the black? You never use the SUV?
I did to come here.
What an elitist you are.
That was the one you sent.
Oh, so you won't pay out of pocket, but if someone will pay for you.
But wait, there's one thing.
But Sam, dude, you're a straight up communist. I love it.
Hold on, there's one thing that you said that
I respect the fact that you're here. You're just espousing socialist communist ideas. Massive respect for you coming here. You can embrace it. It's all good.
The one thing that kind of we just brushed over.
That's who I am.
No, is you saying that you.
So two really interesting things happen here. The first one, this thing that PBD does where he says, I understand you. I get you. I get what person you are. And then he says that Sam is motivated by power and by greed, and he wants to have the outsized power of government. And it's a communist. This is how communists think. And this was all because Sam said that somebody who moves from California to Florida is a tax evader, right? So that literally sets off like 5 minutes of conversation. Not about whether it's better to live in Florida, whether businesses do better in Florida because of the taxes, and whether, how that compares to how California is doing. That's not what they talk about at all. They just lose their minds about the idea that Sam is calling people who move to Florida for that reason tax evaders. So it's semantics. They literally get stuck on the semantics of it to the point that they Google it, and Sam has to say, okay, I should have said tax avoiders, because that's what came up in the Google result. I should have said people who are avoiding taxes rather than evading them. And that's, not only is it a good example of how Patrick Bet David thinks in this context, because he uses that as something to get stuck on, but he also uses it to characterize Sam, not just saying in that he's demonizing people who don't want to pay taxes. He calls him a communist. He says that you are literally like a dictatorial communist. And I think that's so outlandishly funny. And if what he's trying to say is that Sam views himself as the governmental authority that is allowed to say, if you move to Florida rather than California because you want to pay less taxes, you're evading taxes that you have to pay because I said so. And what he's missing there, though, is that, like, it's just the law. Any law, you could say that. Like, yes, laws get made. Humans make laws about what you are and aren't allowed to do. And Sam is very clear that his position is that there should be a top marginal tax rate. And the only point he's making there is that people go to Florida because they want to pay less taxes. It's that simple. But they get stuck on it because they want to use it to, like, really characterize him. And that happens a lot in this debate, and it completely stops the progress of the conversation at multiple points. And another point where it does that is where his co-host, I can't remember his name right now, but he says that because Sam took a higher level Uber over there, that that was some form of greed, even though they were the ones who bought the Uber for him. So he's like, I took the Uber that you sent to get me. And then dude says, oh, so you're willing to be more, to live more luxuriously because somebody else paid for it. Oh, you are a true communist. You really are a true communist. So that's that's all they fucking got, man. This is a whole debate about Sam literally talking about policy, and tariffs is the perfect example. I'll close on this. I'm not going to play any clip about it because I think I can represent the argument that well. And frankly, they didn't have that much productive conversation about tariffs. Most of the policy-oriented discussion was pretty quick. But essentially what the co-host says at one point about tariffs, and this, I thought it was interesting that he said this because we don't hear this from conservatives a lot. They're not actually honest about supposedly what the point of tariffs are. Because if we're going to take tariffs, if we're going to take it to its logical conclusion and not say that this is some kind of negotiating tactic of Trump where he's holding the entire economy hostage over, or that this is some, bid to crash the economy so that he can empower himself. If we're going to put those things aside and say what could possibly be the actual motivation for this policy, the only thing that you can arrive at is that he thinks that the downturn, the inevitable downturn, potentially leading into some kind of recession or depression, that these tariffs will cause, that every economist will tell you these tariffs will cause, is worth it because on the other end, there's essentially a new world order. There's a new way for the resources of the world to be distributed that's more America-centric, that's more fair to America, and that's better for Americans. If I wanted to make the case as well as I could, that's what it is. But the thing is, you don't hear conservatives say that very much. You really don't. And so I like that he made that argument in this debate, because so often we hear, oh, he's not really going to do it, or, oh, we have to trust what Trump's going to do here. Or we're just kind of trying to talk around these tariffs. Oh, well, it's fair. Don't you think these tariffs are fair? Or don't you think it's a negotiating tactic? But really, if they were to talk about what the actual policy is here, supposedly, that what they would have to tell their audience is that Trump is okay with what's about to happen to you because of these tariffs. Trump is okay with possibly collapsing the economy, likely collapsing the economy, because he thinks that on the other side is prosperity. And there's a reason they can't tell their audience that, because their audience has a lot to lose and can't necessarily afford to just hold it out and make it to the other side. And so what these guys have to do is they have to make moralistic claims about what's fair. He literally says the golden rule. He says, have you ever heard of the golden rule? Treat others the way you want to be treated. That's his justification for these tariffs, because it's horrific policy, and they might think that if they hold out long enough, that they'll come out okay on the other end of it. But ultimately, they know that a lot of their audience isn't. And that's why they can't afford to be honest about it. But overall, you know, good on them for having somebody on their platform who will be honest about it. I do think it's probably a net positive for them to keep having Sam around. And I think if Sam wants to keep, you know, going fucking judo style with 20 conservatives at once, he's doing a great job at it and he should keep it up.